Exploring the Analects special video-only episode. Tools and Methods. Hey folks, this is Elliott Bernstein. Thanks for joining me for this special video-only episode of Exploring the Analects. Today I'm focused on tools and methods that I've been building that I think are useful for helping understand the Analects. The first one I'm going to dive into is the Analects.net website. And then I'll show a little local tool that I've been using to help analyze different scholarly interpretations and come up with what I call synthetic translations. Let's get into it. I'm on Exploring the Analects, or the Analects.net website right now, and I talk about this basically every episode, but maybe you haven't had the chance to take a look. Exploring the Analects website has episode guides, and it also hosts the full text of the Analects. I've made a bunch of improvements recently that hopefully make reading the Analects on the website even more useful, enjoyable, help you understand, and all of that. But let me walk you through just a little bit of it here and show you why I think it's a great resource for anyone who listens to the podcast or watches the videos. Every episode of Exploring the Analects has an episode guide. You'll find the link on the video description on YouTube, and I should probably start posting it on the other websites as well, Spotify and Apple Podcasts. But here it is. On the front page, you find the link to the very first episode guide, as well as every other one. It's typically in order, reverse chronological order, that is. And you can pop into the first episode guide here for Don't Be a Tool. You'll actually even see that I've got all three listening methods or viewing methods right there on the page as well. So you don't have to visit YouTube if you don't want. Don't have to go to Spotify or Apple Podcasts. All three of them can be listened to or viewed right there. The episode guides give you a lot of concrete information that you might not get if you're just watching the video or listening to the podcast. For example, you've got the passage right there. You can hover over the passage's text, and you'll get pop-up definitions. If you're on mobile, these are modals, so you can tap on them and they'll show a nice little square there where you get the definition. For the most part, if you've got the episode guide, you're going to get more specific definitions of these words than you would in a general sense, if you just look them up in the dictionary. So 子曰 might not show up in the actual Chinese dictionary that you use, but it will be here as a combination of words that are found in this particular passage and episode. You'll get the informal definition that I use, the interpretation that I describe every time, as well as the more formal definition, that I use for the episode. Then you've got other commentary that I make throughout the episode, and some language notes. I think the language notes are really useful here, and they're essentially what I go over in the audio. But of course, since they're written down here, and this is so textually oriented, you're going to get a lot of additional information here that you just get very briefly in the videos and only through the audio on the podcast. Some episodes have additional features, and so if I scroll down a bit, I think the one that I like a lot here is Hiding Behind a Smile. This has a mermaid diagram. So if you remember this particular passage in this episode, we've got a couple of characters that we discuss quite a bit. This Zhu Tuo and Song Chao. These two characters, they have relationships with a lot of other characters in the entire episode and parts of the Analects. And so we've got this handy diagram right here. This is called a mermaid diagram. And what it shows is the three families, Duke Ding, Confucius, and how they interacted with one another. Then where Confucius went after he fled his home state to the state of Wei. He traveled to Wei. He met Duke Ling, who I also talk about quite a bit, who is the father of Kwai Kwai and the husband of Nanzi. And then you can get a little bit more information about, how Duke Ling was associated with Prince Chao and Priest To. I think this helps quite a bit here. You even get a nice little graphic here of the poster for the Confucius movie that was put out some years ago, starring Zhou Runfa and Zhou Xin. Zhou Shun, excuse me. But yeah, it's quite a lot that you can look at and learn about. And I think that it's a wonderful resource for anybody who's spending time with these episodes. One more thing that you can do on the analects.net website is view the full text. If you're interested in a particular topic or you want to look up some Chinese characters, for example, that can be done here as well. Let's say you want to look at all passages that include the character 学 here, right, to study, and you just pop it in. It's quite fast, and there you've got it. 1.1, 1.6, 1.7, they all contain this character. You've also got other ways of searching and filtering, so you can go to a specific book, or you can use quick filters for some already indexed concepts, benevolence, Ren, disciples, Yan Hui is right at the top, and other figures who appear frequently in the Analects. But one thing that I like quite a lot here is that you can look at a particular passage, and we've got this reader mode. Reader mode is very nice. It lays it out with bigger text. You can also adjust the size of the text. And if you're on a reader or a mobile device, you've got various ways that you can move through the passages. So, you've got these arrows here, but also you can double tap the margins, which I think works on desktop just like we've got here. And you can see that we're going passage 1.5, 1.4, go back. So it's a little like turning pages. One other thing with some of the longer passages, so if we go to chapter 20, which has a very long passage right at the beginning, you'll see that there is, the text gets cut off at the bottom here. If you're on an e-reader and you're reading this and you start scrolling, you'll find that it actually smudges. Well, if you change the scroll method to jump, which is for e-reader, then you can just pop down, so instead of smudging the screen, it will just get you to the next lines directly. One other thing that you'll learn here is that you can use dark mode. So some people will prefer this, and you've got tone colors. If you want to learn how to say these words properly, which I myself have quite a bit of a challenge with, turn on tone colors and you've got them right there for you. You might have a little easier time remembering to say yao instead of yao, or yue instead of yue. Hopefully you find all this really useful. You've got another way that you can display the tone characters. If you don't like the actual character turning a color, you can have each character have its own background color, and you can customize the colors as well. So these are little ways for you to learn, study, and understand. The next thing that I wanted to show is this fun little tool that I've been working on, which is an annotation tool for the Analects. And as you probably know, I've got quite a few versions of translations of the Analects that I read and think about in order to come up with my own opinions and thoughts about what these passages could mean. Well, here are 7 of them, and we're looking at passage 1.1. The Legge, which is from the 1800s, shows up first. We've got Slingerland, which I find very useful. There's Payman-Nee's version. And we've also got a few others here. We've got Moss Roberts, Ames and Rosemont, D.C. Lau, Burton Watson, and a couple of synthetic translations, which I've been finding very interesting lately. What's this all about? Well, first of all, I wanted a way to look at all these different translations all in the same place. And so I've got a data file, and I've put the translation for each passage into the data file for each one of these different translators. There are a couple problems here and there, but for the most part, it's all lined up. And I kind of can just compare them at a glance. I've got statistics here, which is quite a lot of fun. So if you look at Slingerland, you can see that the English centroid, which I'll get to in a second, and the centroid compared to the Chinese source is considered to be at the top. I find that very interesting to begin with. Another interesting element here is that Legge's tend to be the longest, an average of 54 words. Roberts tends to be the shortest at 44 words, and that pretty much lines up with what I'd expect too. Roberts is very interesting. It's also a very terse take, and it tends to be quite a bit different than some of the others. So let's go back to this English centroid, and you'll see that Roberts is right at the bottom here. That last point that I made is why he's at the bottom here. It's not necessarily saying he's done anything wrong, but if you look at all of these different translations in comparison to one another, and you plot them in one of these so-called vector spaces that large language models let us use today, you'll find that Slingerland's words, his phrases, really fall in a central position compared to every other translator out there. So he's done a very good job of finding that linguistic midpoint between all of these different translations, that most of them were out there at some point before his, but I think Payman-Nee's was translated after his, and Roberts definitely was. That's the newest that we've got. So Slingerland has done this really good job of finding that linguistic midpoint. What I decided to do was I wanted to get that centroid score and then come up with some additional possible translations and see whether or not I could get it even more toward the center of all of these different translations that are out there already. And this is sort of what we've come up with here. You can see a couple of the translations that have been suggested. The synthetic translation for 1.3, which is quite short, is those who speak cleverly and wear an ingratiating expression rarely show true benevolence. Okay, so we can actually see how that lines up with all of the other translations. Those who speak cleverly. Actually, none of the translations here start with those who, so that's an interesting choice. But speak cleverly, I mean, we've got clever there. We've got clever probably does appear in some others. Yep. Watson uses it. Slingerland uses it. Ingratiating, you can check as well. It appears in one, DC allows, and expression as opposed to appearance. actually it only appears in the synthetic. So then you've got benevolence, which probably does appear, okay, in the DC Lao as well. So you can see that it used elements of other translations to come up with its own. At the beginning, I was showing this translation 1.1, and there are all these crazy colors all over the page here. What are those? This is a kind of annotation that this system that I created allowed me to put on the page here. And it's just a whole lot of fun. So for each translation that you see here, you've got the master said, right? It's basically the same in every single one of these. So when you see these two characters, 子曰, Legge translates it as the master said, so does nearly everyone else. Roberts uses our master, Confucius said. Moving on to 学, which is a bit more interesting, to learn, learning, having studied, having learned something, and studying, and so forth. And some of them are a bit more varied than others. We can kind of scroll down and see. Let's see, distant quarters, afar, far distances, a long way off. So those do kind of vary a bit. And there's definitely some subjective decision making here on my own part. I mean, am I 100% confident that, Legge translated, let's see, is he not who as what? Bu yi who? Well, I don't know. Maybe. Can't go back and ask him. It's not been around for a good couple 100 years. But yeah, there's various ways that these characters or sets of characters have been chosen for translation, and you can get an indexing of them if you do this markdown. But why did I decide to do this markdown? I've got to say, there's a website. It's called Confucius.pages. Confucius.page. And it's actually something that I found myself going back to once in a while. And I got this idea here, right? So you've got a highlighted character and then where it appears in one of the English translations. It's a very cool little website, but I wanted to take it another step for my own research and thinking. And so what I did was this, but I also noticed that some of my synthetic translations were not going so well. Gonna try to find one. Well, here it is, passage 2.6. Meng Wubo asked about filial piety. The master said, children worry only about their parents' illness. Now, that's wrong. This synthetic translation got it backwards. You can see every other translation puts it the other way around. Parents worry about their children's illness. That's meaning that children should only give their parents one thing to worry about, and that is their illness. It does not mean that children should only worry about their parents' illness or one thing, that being their parents' illness, right? It's not, that would be a pretty silly interpretation. And I thought to myself, well, how can I get more information about these translations into context and well-defined so that the synthetic translations that are generated can get it right? The way to do this is through the annotations, right? If I say that a character at this position means their children, or at, this position, well, let's see, right? This chi is ambiguous. It's a marker that means there. it's not necessarily referring to children, but if I do enough to mark the different passages and make sure that it's clear what the order is and what the relationship of the words is in each one of these different passages, then when I pass that to an LLM, it's a local LLM in this case, to decide what possible translations could be, then it's going to have a much better chance of guessing that it should not be flipped around like this particular synthetic translation ended up being. So you can see that after I constrained this translation by passing in the annotations, it did get it right. And it said, parents need only be anxious about their children's illness. It did not say that children worry only about their parents' illness. So that's one way that I decided to use it. There's another type of translation that I've been doing, which is a what you would call a reconstructed translation, and that's based on solely on the annotations that we've got there. So what it does is it takes each one of these characters and every one of these different renderings of the character, and it finds in that same vector space that I talked about a center point. And it says, I'm going to use that, rather than come up with a bunch of candidates, which I can explain in a second how exactly it comes up with this synthetic translation. It's a bit different. It finds the center point in that vector space for this local LLM. And it says, I'm going to use this, as my rendering for this particular Chinese character. So maybe among the constant perseverance, have occasion to repeatedly, when timely, repeatedly, etc., it decides that when timely or something like when timely really is at the center point of all of these other things. It's what they're all revolving around conceptually. So it decides to use that in its rendering. And it comes up with pretty decent versions. How it does the synthetic translation is a bit different. In the synthetic translation, basically it gives the local LLM that I mentioned the Chinese characters, and then it says, come up with 100 different possible translations of this phrase. And then it takes each one of those 100 translations and it asks which one of these is closest to the center point of all of these other English language translations. Not only does it do that, it passes it to a multilingual LLM. So it has in that vector space not only the English language words, but also the Chinese characters. And it constrains the translation by weighting it better if it also gets closer to the Chinese characters, the original Chinese characters. And so that has turned out to be getting pretty good scores. It's does fit well into the space of all of the other translations. But as I mentioned with 2.6, it does occasionally come up with really wonky off-base translations, which is why I've been experimenting with other approaches as well, like the constraints of the actual annotations, or just using the annotations themselves in the vector space alone. There are some caveats here in terms of doing this type of translation. And I haven't used any of these translations in the actual podcast episodes. I find this to be a fun thought experiment or an interesting way of exploring what the meaning could be, but it is highly derivative, right? So if translators in general have chosen a very off-base translations, if they all have come to the same conclusion and it is the wrong conclusion, then this translation is also going to be no good. It's trying to get to the midpoint of all these different interpretations, and that's just not going to be useful if all the interpretations are bad. Another thing is that they're all equally weighted right now. So, Legge was written in the 1800s. Roberts was written last year. Should they all be equally weighted? Legge's language tends to be kind of archaic. So that may be pulling it in a certain direction. If that's the type of translation that you want, that's okay. But he also had other influences that may not make it particularly relevant to today. He was a missionary, right? He wanted to tie the translations of the Analects back to Christian ideas. So if that's not something that you feel is going to serve the translation well, then maybe you weight Legge differently. Or maybe you discard Legge from the set and you just have it as reference material. You could do the same with other translations here. I've got one or two translations that I don't even display here that I tend to think don't really add anything, or they are just so spotty in their quality that probably are not worthy of inclusion. So, yes, derivative, potentially misled. I have some other ideas that I might actually bring in here, and this is one way that I do my own research and occasionally find brings a lot into my thinking for the episodes. And this is a photo of a text. I've mentioned this text before in the episodes. It's by a scholar from the early 20th century whose name is Cheng Shude. And he synthesizes many, many different thinkers and Confucian scholars in one place. So he's got one section for each passage of the Analects. It's a 2-volume collection. And so what I could do is I could take the text here, which actually, I frequently do this. I am not amazing at understanding classical Chinese. I still, especially this sort of more modern classical Chinese, there's a lot to it. And so I'll grab the characters here and I'll start throwing them into a dictionary to understand a bit more of what I need. But I could also supplement, right? I could supplement these passages with that commentary. I could supplement these passages with the commentary that's made like by Slingerland and me in their own books, because this is contextualizing, the actual translation itself. If all the commentators in the Chinese write that the character shi, right, which in modern times just refers to time in general, if every commentator says that shi is about repeated practice, then maybe we should go with that. But Legge says constant perseverance. That's not about repetition. Pei Ni does say it's repeatedly. Robert says when timely. Slingerland says when you have occasion to do it. So there is a lot of sort of contention over what this should mean. But if the scholarly interpretations all say shi is about repeated practice, if most of the English translation commentaries also say it's about repeated practice. I mean, okay, we can go with that. Or we could further complicate things and bring in a set of texts that were written around the same time as Confucius and see what the language implies should be chosen. What is the meaning that is used by his contemporaries? That's a step I really have not taken, but could also be taken in creating this kind of synthetic translation. So I hope you found this interesting, and you see a bit about what I do when I'm coming up with these episodes, how I dive into their meaning. In fact, you can go back to these pictures one more time and you can see I've been working on this one, this goo goo, the goo that is not a goo. That's for the next episode. And really looking forward to putting that one together for you. Been reading up on what different people had to say about ritual vessels, their uses, their forms, and whether or not even they referred to a ritual vessel during the times that this passage was being interpreted. In the Han, for example, apparently this gu, it referred to a piece of wood, like a little chip of wood that you would write some notes on. Had no idea about that. But it didn't mean that during Confucius's time. So for the most part, the consensus is that, yes, this did refer to a ritual vessel. All right, well, I'll leave it at that. Thanks for listening. I hope you had some fun here. I have fun with this every day. Give me a shout if you have any questions, if you have any thoughts. I'd love to hear from you. It's Elliott@analects.net. And I'll see you on the next episode very soon.